this week with an apology for the quality of the audio recording. I've been sick for almost the full week and keep waiting for this respiratory infection to clear up and for my voice to get better, but it just doesn't seem to be happening. So hopefully it won't be too miserable to listen to, and you'll be able to kind of deal with the quality of the recording. This week we're going to discuss the development of evolutionary theory, and what this serves to do is get us all on the same page. We entertained the possibility or opened up the conversation for objections and clashes between religion and science in our first discussion post, our introduction, not the Module 1 discussion, but our introductory discussion post. And we're going to really kind of push this point for the time being to make sure everyone at least has an equal understanding of what we mean by evolutionary theory. And so we've got to have the basic understanding of evolution and biology as a whole before we can start talking about the specifics of non-human primates and then ultimately human evolution. So the big questions we're going to ask were, what were the major developments in scientific thinking that led to the discovery of evolutionary processes? How does natural selection operate on biological variation in species to cause evolutionary change over time? What were some of the limitations and gaps in evolutionary theory at the end of the 19th century as we moved into the 20th century? And what is our own country's kind of history in regards to the opposition to teaching evolution? Evolution is fact. I mean, evolution in its most simplest definition is simply change over time. And there is no doubt that things change over time. For centuries predating Darwin, scholars in countries as far apart as Arabia, China, India had observed what they called transformatism, or this idea that there were observable features that changed over time, that life was not constant, that plants and animals changed in the very nature of their characteristics. So, we can see this reflected in some of the changes that we as a species ourselves have selected for through artificial selection and the process of plant and animal domestication. And as we have that knowledge of how we led changes in domesticated crops, we're able to then observe some of these same sorts of changes happening through natural processes over time. Europe, though, throughout the Middle Ages held to this idea of the fixity of the species, or that life in general was created divinely in its present form and did not change over time. And so creationism is this belief that life was divinely created by God in its present form. We attribute modern creationist thinking most often to the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But creation myths are pervasive. And so as we look to how humans describe and kind of structure the world around them, religiosity, or what we would call small r religion, is a human universal. That is, that when we don't have the knowledge of the natural processes or the scientific processes that lead to the innovation or the development of certain phenomena, then we invoke divine or supernatural explanations. And so, in its most simplest form, we talk about animism, which a few of you mentioned, for example, paganism. In our introductory discussion, paganism is considered an animist religion. It is not the only animist religion. It is simply one of the more recent or modern incarnations of animism. Animism is simply this belief in the supernatural world. And in most indigenous contexts, animism has taken the form of kind of the reverence of nature and the elevation of natural things, plant and animal species, natural phenomenon, even Mother Nature herself, to this kind of deific or spiritual realm, as though the earth could guide the processes that happen to her. The earth could, therefore, in essence, be the divine. But the reason that we talk about creationism kind of under this umbrella of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam is because in terms of modern oppositions to evolutionary theory, the Abrahamic religions, and specifically Christianity and Islam, Judaism is more accepting of evolutionary theory. But the Christianity and Islam are the major, let's say, opposers, the major opposition to widely accepting scientific explanations for natural phenomena. So, this belief in creationism was very prevalent through the 15th and 16th centuries and was thrown into question during the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution was ultimately an outgrowth of European imperialism and colonialism. And the reason I say this is because it was a lot of the observations that were made during exploratory imperialist and colonialist endeavors that kind of cast doubt onto these modern or these contemporaneous explanations for those phenomena. So, for example, from these voyages around the planet, seeking out new natural resources, seeking out new lands to thus colonize, we went from having a belief in the Earth being flat into understanding that the Earth was a spherical body. Now, whether it's absolutely spherical or more oval in shape, we can debate that with the advent of modern technology. But I would love to say that it is widely accepted that it's taught as fact, and everyone believes or accepts the evidence that the Earth is round. But we have had a resurgence of kind of belief in flat Earth, and so I've put a link in this lecture to the Flat Earth Society, which is an organization that kind of speaks to conspiracy theories regarding things like space travel and the Illuminati, the government control, tinfoil hats, all of that wonderful stuff. So if you've thought and really thought that the opposition to the Earth being a spherical celestial body died in the 15th and 16th centuries, then at least peruse the Flat Earth organization kind of on your own time. We, during this scientific revolution, moved to a heliocentric view of our solar system rather than the geocentric view. The idea of the sun being the celestial body that the rest of the planets then revolve around versus the Earth as the center of our universe. We started to understand principles of motion and gravity, and employing kind of higher level scientific and mathematical reasoning to circumnavigating and mapping the globe. We developed innovation in lenses, including both telescopes and microscopes, which allowed us to see aspects that were hidden from us, like the structure of cells, like microscopic organisms. And we started to record the vast diversity of life that was found around this planet. Prior to kind of this Victorian era, we've got John Ray in the 17th century who developed the initial concept of species, and that species were distinguished by their ability to either interbreed or not interbreed. And so we would draw that line between simply two populations of the same species versus two different species based on that definition of whether reproductive isolation was present. And so John Ray gave us our concept of the species and genus and started this tendency towards what we call scientific nomenclature. Carolus Linnaeus added to this in the 18th century with binomial nomenclature, that is, genus-species designations for all identifiable life, and other higher levels of taxonomy, including specifically order and class. And so we had a four-tier level of classifying life on Earth. Thanks to Linnaeus, we've now elevated that to all the way up to the kingdom level. So we've got kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Linnaeus was also the first to place humans in a taxonomic group. And this really bucked the trend of kind of religious ideology at the time, which treated humans as divinely created in God's own image, and thusly humans were not classified according to the same laws of nature as other living organisms. Buffon in the 18th century also recognized the relationship between the external environment and living forms, and began to classify regional diversity in life forms and proposed this relationship between environment and adaptation that then Charles Darwin later builds upon. And Charles Darwin's own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, in the 18th century, wrote poetry and outlined how life originated in the seas and descended from a common ancestor. So the basics of transformatism and kind of the impetus behind evolution were in place before Darwin himself was ever born. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was the first to try to explain the mechanism by which diversity occurs with his inheritance of acquired characteristics. And so Lamarck is generally laughed at in modern explanations of the development of biological thought with this example of how a giraffe got such a long neck. According to the inheritance of acquired characteristics, or the use-disuse theory, it was the use of traits that favored them being passed on to subsequent generations. And so the reason that giraffes have such a long neck was because as lower leaves were eaten, giraffes had to stretch their necks to become longer to be able to reach the upper branches. And once a giraffe had stretched its own neck longer, then therefore its offspring would be born with longer necks, and that trend would continue over subsequent time. So, though this is laughable, and we recognize that we can acquire a lot of variation later in our life that doesn't leave any mark whatsoever on our offspring. I mean, think about things like tattoos, amputations, other forms of body modification. When you're tattooed, it doesn't mean that your child's going to be born bearing a tattoo. And in fact, if you have a baby that's tattooed, you're probably going to have CYFT called on you because that's viewed as abusive kinds of practices. What really was the biggest contribution, though, of Lamarck was the recognition that organisms interact with the environment in which they live in this evolutionary process. So he didn't have the mechanism correct, but at least he's recognizing the presence of particular phenomena, and that is the role that the environment plays in kind of selecting for the overall success of particular organisms. Cuvier contributed with this idea of catastrophism, that maybe all life was divinely created, but we certainly have a diversity of life that's represented on the planet today, and that those organisms that are no longer alive today exist because of catastrophes, natural disasters, etc., earth-wide catastrophes that have happened historically. And so, of course, in this context of Christian creationism, the oft invoked catastrophe that leads to things like dinosaur fossils is the worldwide flood, or Noah's flood. Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace are the kind of fathers of modern day evolutionary theory, and they were contemporaries. They both served as naturalists on exploratory voyages. Darwin, of course, is famous for his voyage on the HMS Beagle, and came from wealthy means. Wallace was mostly self-taught and had to actually work on vessels not as a naturalist but as a crewmate, pursuing his scientific endeavors kind of on the side in his spare time. There were additional influences that were around the same time historically as Darwin and Wallace, whose papers were read by both of them, that were foundational for developing modern evolutionary thought. One of these was Charles Lyell. Lyell is considered to be the father of modern geology. And Lyell pointed out that two things of real value. One, that slow processes accumulated over very long periods of time can lead to magnificent features. So this idea that geological time happened on a much longer scale than what humans could conceptualize, and so that seemingly small changes, that is, like a river that erodes the riverbed at a rate of only 1/4 of an inch of sediment per year over enough time, about 250,000 years, gives rise to something phenomenal like the Grand Canyon in Arizona. This same principle can be applied to the movement of tectonic plates and how mountains grow, giving us something like Mount Everest in as few as 8,500 years. This time scale was really previously unthought of. The idea to this point had been a much younger Earth, and it's really hard for a species that only lives roughly 100 years to be able to think about time in the scope of thousands to hundreds of thousands to even millions of years. Lyell also contributed this principle of uniformitarianism. That is, that similar causes yield similar effects. And so, if we can observe, for example, erosion happening today, and look to rivers like, well, I mean, even the rivers that give rise, the Colorado River giving rise to the Grand Canyon. We can measure the rate of erosion, how much silt is carried in the Colorado River today, and gain some insight into how the canyon itself was created. That by observing modern processes, we can extrapolate back in time and make inferences about the processes that would have given rise to similar features at a different moment in time. The second contemporary who really influenced both Darwin and Wallace was Thomas Malthus. He was an economist who basically is the father of population demography. And he was very struck with a moral dilemma. That is, how could a loving and just and caring God allow such traumatic suffering in the world? And so Malthus, as an economist, was measuring things like class differentials, the difference between those who have guaranteed access to resources and those who don't. And ultimately, of course, what Malthus observed was that having access to resources could be the difference between life and death, that those who were wealthy survived to old ages, had large families, and didn't really appear to struggle, while those who were poor could never make ends meet, were met with higher mortality rates, battled more illness, saw more of their children die, so on and so forth. He ultimately, through mathematical modeling, convinced himself that this was inevitable, according to two principles. The first is that the population's ability to grow is theoretically infinite, but that the ability of any environment to support populations is finite. So our reproductive output, it leads to things like exponential population growth, that we can double our population in a very short period of time. But the reason that biological systems don't get overwhelmed is because the environment kind of operates as a system of checks and balances. The environment, and critically, the number of resources, the amount of resources that are available, creates, therefore, this struggle for existence. So it works in a system of kinds of checks and balances where we don't get runaway population growth because the environment can't support runaway population growth. Rather, we get an increasing but more manageable rate of population growth, where those who are more successful in the struggle for resources will be more successful in leaving descendants in the future generation. There's an additional contribution of a woman by the name of Mary Anning, who lived in France, who was a fossil collector. Her father had died at a very young age, and she collected and sold fossils as a way to supplement her family's income. And these fossils were Mary Anning was not French. She was the southern coast, of Britain. But these fossils were marine fossils, and they were from some of these exposed cliffs, like the cliffs of Dover. And one of the big discoveries that Mary Anning had was the first plesiosaur, or kind of aquatic reptile. So this helped to lend credence to the idea that life began in the ocean, and that a lot of diversity of life was present in the ocean, and that modern forms then maybe evolved from marine forms at a prior point in our history. Darwin's formative years were then spent on the HMS Beagle. This voyage started in 1831. He was back in England by 1836, and he served as a ship's naturalist. So basically what a ship's naturalist does is collects specimens. Darwin did not necessarily measure the diversity of living species. He collected dead ones, in that he caught living animals and then stuffed them and returned those collections to places like his own home, the British Museum, etc. He began the voyage fully expecting fixity of species. He thought that everywhere that the voyage went, life would be similar, that he would see constancy in the diversity of life that we see. Instead, he found some particular observations regarding diversity that threw his whole belief system into question and caused an incredible moral dilemma for Darwin over the next, really, 20, 30 odd years. A few of these observations that became the foundation for his theories, as well as troubled him to his death, include the fact that fossil forms, albeit often larger, resembled modern forms with just slight differences. And this led Darwin to believe that perhaps modern forms evolved from fossil forms, that fossil forms were somehow ancestral to these modern forms. The second is this feature of island zoogeography. This has to do with how features on islands may differ from the mainland. So, for example, we don't find frogs on islands. Can anybody think of why? We do find things like marine iguanas. I mean, the Galapagos were Darwin's most famous stop and really foundational for his development of the theory of evolution by natural selection. But he didn't study turtles on islands. He studied species like lizards and birds. The reason that we don't find turtles on island, or not turtles, frogs on islands, is because frogs are amphibians, and getting to an island involves one of three things really. You can swim, you can raft, you can fly. Birds obviously have an advantage in that they evolved flight. Reptiles can make that swim or can raft and can withstand the salinity of the sea. Whereas amphibians, even if they were rafting on something that contained some water, the salinity would draw the moisture out of their bodies and they would ultimately perish. So you don't find frogs on islands unless those frogs have come kind of hitched a ride with others, like populations of humans moving from island to island. And the third feature that Darwin noted, and your chapter doesn't talk about this, but idea of vestigial traits. And so specifically, Darwin discovered that the pythons of South America had vestigial pelvises. Why on earth would a snake have a pelvis? If it was divinely created in the form that it is now, it would have no need for a pelvis. And so what the existence of vestigial traits allowed for was the idea that they evolved from something else, that their appearance wasn't in their present form, but instead through the successive accumulation of variation that led to what they are today. So Darwin himself speculated that we would, for example, find fossil whales that still had pelvises eventually, and he was not proven correct until 1996. The Field Museum in Chicago a few years back had a phenomenal display on whale evolution that starts with these herbivores that were coastal, that were almost hippopotamus-like, that would venture into the marshes to have access to more grasses, and over time spent more time in the water. Those legs became smaller, developed into fins. The pelvis became non-functional in the sense of not necessarily for anchoring the hip sockets and the legs. Interestingly, among whales, the pelvis has now been co-opted into another function. I've got a friend whose husband does research on kind of whale morphology and how the pelvis functions. It's now an anchor point for the muscles that control the movements of the penis. And so whales apparently have phenomenal flexibility and control, versatility in their movements of their sexual anatomy that's attributed to having a pelvis that's no longer necessary to anchor legs. Well, the Galapagos were Darwin's most famous stop, and the most famous species with which Darwin worked in the Galapagos were his finches. Darwin actually didn't even know that what he had when he brought these specimens back to England were all finches. He just was somewhat, fascinated by the diversity of bird species that he saw. And so he was not an ornithologist. And he brought back all of these birds thinking they were going to belong to different groups of birds. They were going to belong to different families. When instead, um, he had a friend, an ornithologist by the name of John Gould, who looked at his finches, looked at his drawings, and basically told Darwin, "Hey, dude, those are all finches. What you've got is some kind of testimony to some interesting conditions that led to finch diversity." And so what Gould noted as special with Darwin's finches were the variations in beak size and shape. And so here we just have four of Darwin's finches. We've got the one on the bottom right is an insect eater, and kind of low level, not ground dwelling, but low level bushes. Bottom left eats seeds at these kind of low level bushes. Top left eats really hard seeds, lives on the ground. Top right lives on the ground and eats kind of medium shelled seeds. And so Gould noted this variation in beak size and shape. Darwin himself noted the mechanism by which that variation arose. And so as he took specimens from the Galapagos Islands, he noted the habitat they lived in. He noted where he saw those birds, what he saw those birds eating. He took samples of some of their diet, etc. And so when Gould identified that they were all finches, Darwin began to recognize that there was a relationship between beak size and diet. This really started his thinking down this line of physical traits reflecting adaptations to specific environments. All of the finches on the Galapagos Islands evolved from one species of ground finch in the mainland. And yet Darwin found no fewer than 13 distinct species on the islands. By 1844, Darwin had written a summary of his theory of natural selection. He didn't publish this, however, because he anticipated backlash from the scientific community. Not only that, his wife was devout in her belief and her subscribing to creationism as an explanation for the formation of the world. So he didn't want to disappoint his wife. He didn't want to upset the status quo of the scientific community at the time. In 1855, Alfred Russel Wallace published an article that suggested that modern species were descended from other species and that environmental factors shaped the appearance of new species. Thusly, this was evolution that was driven by both competition and natural selection. He actually sent his manuscript to Darwin for comments, and Darwin and Wallace had a rather amicable relationship and wrote back and forth comparing their theories. But what Wallace's paper really did was gave Darwin the kick in the pants, perhaps, that he needed. This drove Darwin to publish his own work. He and Wallace both had papers presented before the Linnaean Society of London in 1858. Neither researchers were present, though. Darwin was grieving the death of his son. Wallace was in Borneo on more exploratory and data collection voyages. In 1859, Darwin published his tome on the origin of species, and this was what forever cemented his relationship with and attribution of the father of evolutionary theory. Darwin was not singular in developing this theory. If Darwin had never published, if Wallace had never published, there were others who were on the cusp of making the same observations and developing the same theories. So this was something that would have come scientifically whether or not Charles Darwin had been the one to bring it forth. And so with On the Origin of Species, Darwin cemented his place in the posterity of science history, and Alfred Russel Wallace was kind of relegated to the sidelines.